Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Mitigating Tariff Impacts and How Businesses Can Stay Agile and Competitive. My name is Imtiaz Karmali. I'm the VP of Sales and Marketing here at eShipper, and I am thrilled to be your host. Whether you're an importer, manufacturer, e-commerce brand, or a logistics provider, today's discussion is designed to help you make better, faster, and more strategic decisions in a rapidly evolving trade landscape. If you're here, you already know that the landscape is changing drastically on a day-to-day basis. Tariffs are no longer just a trading policy. They're a direct operational challenge for businesses, big and small. And we're seeing tariff hikes on Canadian and Mexican imports, a doubling of duties on Chinese goods, and whispering of a potential tariff on the EU as well. So these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they have real consequences in pricing, supply chain, and ultimately in customer satisfaction. What we do know is that the large retailers and businesses, they have much more options. They're able to negotiate their costs at a product level and still get away with similar margins today. Smaller e-commerce businesses aren't in the same position and will need to be much more tactical with their strategies in order to stay aboard and keep that competitive level going. However, today's discussion is not about doom and gloom. We're here to talk about solutions and how Canadian businesses can not only weather these challenges and changes, but actually turn them into opportunities. And to help us unpack this complex issue, we have two incredible experts with us. I'm joined by Hugo Pakula, co-founder and CEO of Tru Identity, a leader in the logistics space and strategy, supply chain optimization, and trade compliance. As we were discussing earlier, Hugo's been traveling quite a bit recently with all of the different challenges and changes that are coming to the table. He's had a seat at the front table and has been discussing a lot of the areas of contention as well as how to put some of these solutions together. So he's been at the forefront of helping businesses rethink their supply chain in response to the global trade shifts. We're also joined by John McClymont, Principal of Operational Innovations, who specializes in supply chain transformation and operational efficiency. John has worked with companies across the industry to, navigate these type of disruptions, optimize costs, and build resilience in their logistics strategy. So together, we're really going to try and break down these tariffs and what these changes mean. We're going to try and explore real business strategies, and most importantly, give you the tools to keep you informed and make strategic decisions. Hugo, it's a pleasure to have you. You've traveled extensively recently and consulted with various organizations across the world. Given your global perspective, what's the sentiment you're seeing amongst businesses? Like, how are different regions reacting to these tariff shifts? And what are the key challenges or strategies that you're seeing emerge?
Yeah, I'm going to break it down nice and simple. I speak to a lot of people that's, very, very large merchants down to, mom and pop, small shops selling online or even in retail in person. I think the real answer here is you shouldn't be overthinking your strategy. We want to try and keep it simple. Let's not bite off more than we can chew. If we can optimize cost a little, that's a great thing. But primarily, it's in the news. Everybody knows about this, right? That's one of the advantages maybe we have, is that it's not like your customers don't know this is going on. People know, and actually they kind of are expecting prices to go up. And so that's something to consider is, do we pass this on? Let's look at our finances. That's the first thing. And then do we have any room to optimize? If you can optimize, take advantage of it for sure. But unless you're a very large, very, very large buyer in wholesale, it's hard to get this negotiating power, but you should try. It's worth trying. We've seen people who literally just ask and they get 5%. 5% makes a big difference at the end of the day. But I think you need to be really intentional about your strategy. And that's at the root of it, is recognizing change is happening all over the place. And if you can find even a 5 or 10% benefit, you should take it.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Hugo. John, you work closely with North American businesses and especially have been quite vocal around how to navigate some of these tariff changes. What are the most pressing concerns you're hearing from your customers and your peers right now? And are there any recurring themes, unexpected challenges that companies are struggling with at the moment?
Yeah, well, look, first, everything sort of Hugo said is probably par and parcel for everyone, right? Everyone's kind of concerned with these things, but something that brings a lot of discussion and has a lot of people, more worried, price increases, competition, whatever, but, it all boils down to sales and revenue, and especially with a lot of the way that our public businesses are and measured and valued is all about year over year growth. And I think that that's got a lot of people more concerned per se than just the concept of saying like, oh, I'm going to pass a price increase on, because the reality is all of these businesses want to be able to grow. And interestingly enough, that mentality is impacting both like the retail segment, but same as the logistics, like service providers, right? Like I had posted not that long ago about GXO stock just tanking. And that was just based on the fact that they were honest about, hey, we've got some customers that are having some issues, they're facing some headwinds, they're going to downsize, like all normal stuff. But it essentially just communicated right away, hey, that year over year growth and that sort of growth curve is going to look different, and it's irking people. And that, more than anything, I think is probably the biggest part of the conversations that I have, since I'm a like get more out of your operations, drive more sales because of your operations type person, just because of the fact that everyone understands that they need to continue to sell more, especially in a world that's getting noisier and noisier, both in terms of just generic options, but also with social commerce just getting more popular every day.
Thank you, John. That is a very diversified way of thinking about things, because there are so many different elements at play here. So as we move into the agenda, first, the idea we want to do is we want to set the stage for understanding the evolving tariff landscape. So what's actually happening, and how does it impact your business? We know that there is multiple changes happening on a weekly basis, and even from our own business, which is in logistics at eShipper, we prepped a whole bunch of additional information we would require from customers. We prepped emails for customers on how changes should happen, and then we hear 3 days before or 2 days before the de minimis still stays, or the tariffs have been delayed, etc., etc. So there's a lot of change happening, and there's changes happening even today, which we'll get into. We'll then take a deep dive into Section 321, which is a critical exemption for cross-border e-commerce that could be on the chopping block. So these are things that businesses will completely have to rethink their strategies. And after that, we'll try and explore strategies that businesses are using to adapt, whether it's supply chain diversification, tariff engineering, or just exploring alternative markets. Finally, we'd love to get your questions in, and we'll go into a much more tactical problem-solving thought process. At the end, I want you to stay tuned till the end, because we will be drilling into a macro-level discussion, which will include dropping stock prices, opinions on what we feel will come next from the US administration, and also how the rest of the world is reacting to some of these changes. So let's get right into it. So, understanding the tariff landscape. To understand the road ahead, we first need to map out where we are today. The US landscape, or the US has ramped up its tariff strategy significantly, impacting key trading partners like Canada, Mexico, and China. We're seeing a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican goods, a doubling of duties on Chinese imports in key sectors, including electronics, textiles, auto parts, and even potential tariffs that are about to go onto the EU. One very, very important thing we're seeing right now is the increased scrutiny, customs enforcement, more audits, more penalties, and a lot less room for errors. We will also see an introduction of Canada's retaliatory measures this evening, a new 25% tariff on about $30 billion worth of US product that should be taking effect midnight tonight. And this is in addition to the $30 billion that was imposed last week. We've got other upcoming reciprocal tariffs that Trump has talked about that will be announced April 2nd. And these shifts don't happen in isolation. Trade policy is a domino effect. And when one country imposes a tariff, others will respond with reciprocal measures, as we see in Canada. This creates uncertainty, price volatility, and increased costs for businesses operating in global supply chains. So getting right into it, Hugo, in your experience, how should businesses read between the lines of these policy shifts? Beyond the headlines, what are the underlying motivations behind these tariffs? And how do they kind of shape long-term strategy for businesses?
Yeah, there's a lot of geopolitical analysis we could do here. I think a lot of this comes down to that wars used to be fought militarily, and now I think it's a war of manufacturing. We've moved manufacturing offshore for many years, 20, 30 years, and capabilities have shifted, right? We don't have the same, not only from a wage perspective, capability, but even technical capability. Other countries are better at manufacturing some of these goods. That's not to say you should stop. We should just we could just stop sourcing tomorrow. That's not going to happen. We're gonna have to manufacture it somewhere. I think the big change in reading between the lines is that a lot of this change used to be by legislation, right? Even in the last few years, we saw, de minimis legislation being proposed, closing the de minimis loophole in China's de minimis abuse act, restoring trade fairness, import security fairness. There's a lot of policy that's proposed. Then we see things like the Fighting for America Act. We see things like the Ships for America Act be proposed. And it takes time. We have months and months to comment. They have comment periods. But now it's by executive order, right? These changes can happen really out of nowhere, and you have to be able to react really, really quickly. Moreover, it's not an isolated issue, right? We see every country seemingly respond in kind and relatively equal in size, right? A $30 billion action in the US, 28 billion euros action. So I think today it's not that picking the right strategy is the answer. It's actually being ready for change, being prepared. Because that's going to be the root of this, is when we see the dust settle, which we're still working towards, you'll need to be ready with a strategy and be able to shift. And shifting is expensive. So reading between the lines, it's change is going to continue to happen at a fast pace.
You're having multiple discussions at a much higher level than business owners. It's at policy change level. Is the sentiment that these tariffs will stay for the long term, or is the sentiment that we need to have short-term solutions such that we show our strength? So, for example, from a Canadian perspective, it's reciprocal tariffs. Do you find that at policy level, this is something that they're preparing for another 4 years of the U.S. administration, or do you see this as more 6 months, maybe 3 months, and this will all die away soon when Trump gets what he needs or what he wants?
Yeah, forgive me. I'm just looking for my crystal ball. I forgot. I think I forgot it today. It's tricky, right? We don't know the answers. We don't know where this is going. I do think at the very least we can say this is a negotiating tactic, right? At the very least. But if not, there's an argument that says this trade is happening no matter what. Maybe America first policy means at least let's make some money off that trade. I mean, that could be the long-term strategy. I think what we should be prepared for is uncertainty to continue, certainly for the rest of this, I'm going to say for the rest of this administration, in that these things could happen at the drop of a hat, which we didn't know could really happen prior to, say, 5 or 6 years ago.
John, as somebody who has worked with companies navigating these disruptions, what are the most immediate operational challenges businesses should be preparing for?
Okay, so I will give you the same answer, give everyone the same answer that I've given to my clients. And I take a little bit stronger position maybe than Hugo. I don't have a crystal ball either, but I'm much more in the camp that one way or another, things aren't just going to go back to the way that they were. There's some real strong trends that are sitting there when it comes to debt, when it comes to sort of like future technology and rare earth elements, when it comes to global positioning. And, like Hugo mentioned, that domestic ability for core manufacturing, right? Like steel and aluminum is a great example. Like Canada makes some of the best aluminum in the world, like with our sort of reduced CO2 emission process and things like that. So even at the highest quality, it's not given any kind of pass, right? So whether it's tariffs or whether it's just some other fundamental changes in the system, for example, and I saw a question earlier specifically about 321, but I don't expect things to go back to the way that they were. So, when you're talking about your operational challenges for any business, big or small, it would be that anticipate and prepare for a noticeable shift in terms of your either your operating processes, your operating costs, your go-to-market strategies. I don't think it wouldn't be something that I would recommend to anybody to essentially just like wait it out and things will go back to normal. I don't believe that you're going to get that type of complete reset from where we were, like, let's say, a year ago.
Thank you. Okay. We've got a question here, and maybe John, you want to take this one on. For a small e-commerce business that ships from Canada to the US, but product is made in China, will the tariff just be added to the package at customs, and the customer in the US has to pay the 25%? Or is there a way for us, the seller, to pay the tariff to keep the customer relations strong?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, tariffs, like in their most basic sense, and keep in mind that before income tax, this was like the number one revenue stream for like any country was tariffs. It doesn't really matter who pays realistically at the end of the day. If you want to pay for your customers, include like whether it's included in the price, whether you sell at the same price and just take it out of the margin. But if you choose not to pass it on, it still has to get paid. So most certainly a business can pay that themselves if they choose. You can choose to split the difference. It just depends on how you want to handle it. A lot of businesses, though, unfortunately, wouldn't necessarily be operating at a level where if they gave up that much of their margin across the board, that they would be able to continue to essentially still be whole when it was all said and done at the end of the day.
Yeah. And Hugo, maybe you can hold me true to this, but with shipping out of Canada into the US, you have two modes. So you have a DDU or a DDP, which is what John was mentioning earlier. With the DDU, your client ends up paying the 25% tariff, but there are charges above that for all the administration that goes into getting them to pay that fee. And when it's a DDP, then you can pay the tariff yourself. You can pay any other import taxes that are due on arrival at the border. And again, with a lot of companies, the change is not just going to be a simple 25% tariff. You have to understand, and we'll go into this in the mid of this particular webinar, but for every product that crosses the border that needs to be stopped and inspected, and then there's a tariff that is due on that particular product, there will be administration fees. There will be a whole bunch of information that the administration will require, like country of origin. In some cases, you may need to pay bond fees. In some cases, you may need an IRS number. So there's a ton of information that will come with this detailing, whether you pay the tariff or not. But this is some of the implications of some of these changes that are coming. Hugo, do you want to touch on that at all?
It's a very big question, but I'm going to tackle it. I think the quick sort of summary there is that DDU versus DDP will change the experience your customer has with paying the tariffs and duties. But either way, someone is paying those tariffs and duties, right? And often it'll be passed on to the consumer. I'm generally of the opinion that DDP is a better solution to deliver duties paid, in that you've already collected that amount, or you've been willing to absorb it into your margins, because it means that the customer doesn't have this like pay on delivery problem, right? When they receive the goods, they then go, oh, there's another $28 of additional cost, including, like you said, the additional fees just to even collect those duties when you do cash on delivery or payment on delivery. So I think DDP is really something worth considering for sure. But it does bring in additional challenges, right? Are we going to absorb those duties and tariffs? Or are we going to collect them up front? There are solutions to automate that and checkout for e-commerce.
Exactly.
For sure. But I think we need to be looking at it maybe slightly more big picture, is what's our strategy going to be for collecting payment of duty, where we used to live in an environment where a lot of these goods could come in duty free. We now don't.
Absolutely. And to Hugo's point, our team will put together a few different softwares that are available for e-commerce business checkout. I think that's really important to plug that in, because there are numerous softwares. So the way a software would work is, as you plug in your SKU and your commodity and the value of your product, some of these softwares can quickly tell you what the tariff fee will be, what the duties and taxes will be on arrival, allowing you to either let your customer know that this is your full landed cost and you're going to need to pay that upfront, or you can absorb part of that cost yourself, or as John and Hugo mentioned earlier, you can split that.
They'll also, just thought I'd throw in, they can also guarantee the landed cost, which is a huge benefit, I think, to sellers, in that you might estimate it yourself, right? Oh, we think it's 20%, but it changes tomorrow, whatever. They're absorbing any kind of risk there. So they're doing their own work to make sure that they're right on those numbers. But that could be a benefit for sure, avoiding brokerage fees, processing fees for cash on delivery payments of duties.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how fast e-commerce shopping carts like your Shopify's and BigCommerce's will actually move to add all of this additional detail into checkout. So of what we know now, a Canadian product going into the US will require a HTS code, not an HS code anymore. You need a country of origin sticker on each package. So there's fundamental changes that are already in place that, you need to speak to a broker or you need to speak to your shipping partner to ensure that you're doing it compliantly to avoid delays. We have one customer who's been shipping leather bags for over 3 years. She ran into an issue at the port of Buffalo where CBP flagged her shipment for not having a country of origin sticker on the package.
I'll throw in there, the worst thing you could say would be, we've been doing this for 3 years.
Quick question for the audience, as well as John and Hugo. What enforcement trends are you seeing at the borders? Is there any news you're hearing from the border side right now from your customers?
Let's just see, while they're answering, I've noticed a few questions coming up, and just to maybe stop it from rolling. Any of these tariffs, I think it's important that everyone understands, irrespective of how your stuff is bouncing around, whether it's moving through different countries, whether it's got, different layover, whatever you think it is, tariffs are based on country of origin. And, Hugo, I'm sure you can add to this when it comes to compliance. Like, that in itself it seems like, oh, it's just, say it's from here, say it's from there. You can't, it's extreme. You have to be very diligent about, saying where something came from. Because if you ever found yourself in a position where you changed that and it turned out to not be true, it would really not be good for you or your business. But that kind of helps some of these questions I see bouncing around in the chat about, like, well, what if this, what if that, what if this? If that product was made in China and it moved through 6 other countries first for whatever reason, it's a Chinese product. Same with a Canadian origin product, same with a Germany origin product, or whatever it is. We can talk a little bit later about, what that might mean and different things about the origin, but that's just to answer that question that keeps popping up over and over in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you for that, John. So let's move to Section 321. For those who don't know, Section 321 has been the cornerstone of cross-border trade. It allows duty-free shipments valued under $800 and makes it really, really cost-efficient to move products into the US. But there's a growing discussion about modifying it or even removing its provision completely. Something that could have big implications on the fulfillment strategies and pricing models. And I recall, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, the de minimis was $200 and then changed to $800. And obviously, we're seeing a ton of businesses that are able to benefit from this, but a lot of businesses also taking a lot of advantage. And we see Section 321 in different lenses, right? Like, it is harming the domestic US businesses to be able to compete when you've got a whole bunch of products coming from outside of the US for ultra cheap prices, and taking over different markets, whether they be the apparel markets, electronics, etc. A new executive order was issued on the 2nd of March, which reverses trade rules, but does not yet eliminate the de minimis duty-free treatment. This means that business will continue as usual for now. However, this is only temporary. If Section 321 changes, businesses will need to consider the impact on their e-commerce operations and pricing, processing times at customs, and this could increase significantly because every single package now needs to be looked at properly. And then, as we discussed in the slide before, whether to shift to a DDP or a DDU model. So, Hugo, quick question for you. If Section 321 were to be restricted or removed, what are the most significant operational challenges you feel businesses would face? And are we talking about a fundamental shift in fulfillment models? So people just moving warehousing directly into the local market?
Yeah, I think there is a shift coming, assuming, if we're talking about it going away, that's a big strategy shift, moving your goods here in bulk, but it is the more traditional way, right? It's what your logistics partners will, be able to help you with for sure. It's just, they know that model. But at the same time, we talk about these very small businesses. There's not always a good reason to move significant amounts of inventory, set up warehouses, negotiate agreements. If you've only got 2 orders a week going to a country, it's probably not worth you setting up all of that, doing all of that work. So I think all of this has to be put in context. But I do think it's worth going backwards whenever we talk about de minimis to where it started, right? It was established in the Tariff Act of 1930. So this is not a new policy. This has been around for a long time. Originally, those volumes would come in by the post. And it was established because part of the reason is because it costs significantly more to enforce the rules and collect the duties than you would ever collect in duty income. Right?
Yes.
But if this were to change, right, it actually is not too costly. There's an argument. I was just talking with someone on LinkedIn this week about it, that these goods are coming in bulk, hundreds of thousands at a time or tens of thousands at a time. It actually would be fairly reasonable to assess duty and do it fairly cost effectively. So it's a thing that even experts are still negotiating, right? Something to keep in mind. Look, I described this Type 86 clearance, which is a de minimis entry, as a duty-free simple clearance, right? At its core, it's really easy to use. It requires very little data. You can basically bring those goods in fairly simply and be afforded the duty-free benefit. But what we're talking about changing likely is this Type 86 going away, rather than potentially all of de minimis, right? De minimis is the threshold, $800. I don't know that we're going to see that disappear. It is a hard thing to manage if you move the volume, but it could create American jobs. There's opportunities here. So I look at it like 2 big challenges. One is you've got this sureties and bond challenge, right? You now must have a bond. If it goes away, let's say, sorry, not now, just to be clear, if it were to change, you would really need to be prepared with a bond, because you'll have to pay duties now on a lot of your imports. So if you import frequently, that's something to consider, and making sure you've got enough bond and surety to cover your imports. And secondly is that you're much more at risk to non-compliance, right? If you fail to meet the new burden of data or of compliance checks, we're talking about full payment of duties on the goods, of course. Then criminal penalties for the importer of record, penalty up to the full domestic value of the goods. If you misvalue the item, right? If you use the wrong valuation method and you use your manufacturing cost rather than your retail cost, for example, depending on your entry type. We got penalties from 2.5x up to 4 times the loss of duties, payment of liquidated damages. They could seize your goods. I'm just rattling off. These are all of the things they can do at the same time to punish you for violating the rules. So getting it right really matters. And I like to say there's two ways to do things, right? Right and again. And again is very expensive.
Hugo, if you can take that question really quickly while you're speaking, the Type 86, is it the same as Section 321?
It's pretty close, but it's not exactly the same. Type 86 is an entry type. So it's when you file with customs, you have to choose either in the formal environment, a Type 11 or a Type 1, or essentially a de minimis entry today is like Type 86. Okay. But you could also use another type called, you could use a 321 data pilot. If you have a certain carrier partner who is part of that pilot. But even Type 86, just to be clear, they still call it a test. It's called the Type 86 test. It's still considered, and they're doing 1 billion parcels a year with this test.
Amazing. Thank you for going into that detail. Before I bring John in, a couple of things that I want the audience to know is businesses like ours are setting themselves up for this trend too. So, you'll find a lot of logistics businesses at the moment that are finding spaces in the US to be able to help their Canadian customers bring their inventory into the US from Canada if needed. So warehousing in the US is definitely a legitimate option that a lot of people are considering. And there's tons and tons of great warehousing companies in the US that you can work with. And please reach out to us if you need any information on some of the partners you should be working with over there. Also, when it comes to shipping policies in the US and shipping options, there's a ton. So it's not all doom and gloom. If you've seen the US as a great market to grow into, this might just be an accelerator for you to get into that market locally. And there's a ton of ways to do it, especially for Canadians. So definitely reach out if you need any options there. Secondly, I think, which is even more important, is Hugo, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, which was people used to use the postal service a lot more. So Canada Post has become very bright and alert to all of the changes that are happening. And there's a ton of shipping companies that are giving a postal service from Canada to the US. That could be a short-term fix. The prices are definitely not the same, but the postal clearance has different rules and different ways to mitigate some of these risks that you're seeing. So just want to put it out there. There are some really good options, and you can always reach out to us for advice and for more information. With that being said, John, moving back into this discussion on Section 321, what are alternative strategies that businesses should be considering? And Hugo touched on bond and bond fees. Are bonded warehouses, duty paid models, or alternative entry points viable solutions? Like, an entry point from India instead of from Canada, or from, for example, Mexico, etc. So maybe give us a 2 cents on what you're seeing right now and what your advice would be.
Yeah. So one of the big things with a lot of people doing like this type of entry, right, especially for small parcel individual shipments, is that it's not just about getting into the US. There was actually a benefit both in Canada and Mexico as well, right? If you imported product into those countries, right, into a warehouse or whatever, and it was not for domestic sales, and then it was going to be used right for export, you were kind of saving on both ends, right? You weren't paying any type of import fees or duties into Mexico or to Canada, then you're not paying any duties into the US. So I think that that's something really important just to clarify, because of the fact that that's a substantial cost reduction in your overall operations and your end-to-end fulfillment when you think about it. So that in itself, is one thing to manage. To answer more broadly about the 321, do I think that it's going to go away completely? Honestly, no, just because of the fact that like the whole concept, like, it could stay at $200 and it would still be just as destructive essentially as it is today for volume and product coming into the country, right? Like the $800 versus even in Canada, it's 125, Mexico, it's like 117 or something like that. Like these amounts of money for the way that people are shopping on e-com, especially when they're, purchasing from China or other areas in Southeast Asia or India, for example, on a unitary basis, it can still work. So, what I've been recommending to a lot of people is that I see more of the changes coming to procedures, data, visibility, transparency, really being able to make sure. If I were running that type of program, for example, I would build a lot of the program around types of random audits, focused audits, different types of ways to solve the problem rather than trying to track and catch everything. Collect your duties or collect whatever fees you may want from this stuff coming in, because it's important to know that the de minimis into the US isn't a US problem. Countries all over the world are struggling with the fact that like this e-commerce activity is just bringing all kinds of goods into their markets, right? There's huge pushback in the UK, about companies like Shein, for example. They're trying to set up operations in some of those countries. Germany is the same thing, as another big market where these low-cost goods coming in is not necessarily well received. So across the planet, I think you're going to see more changes to what is going to be expected for these types of movements. To come back to your bonded warehouse, so a bonded warehouse, where the benefit goes there is that you would get to be able to bring the product in, not pay your immediate duties or whatever until you essentially actually like sell it off and it leaves to be sold. It doesn't obviously get you to the same place as having a completely sort of like duty-free setup or import fee setup like is today with Canada and Mexico and then going into the US. It does help you better manage your cash flow. So I think that that's one thing that's really important for a lot of people, whether it's when you're talking about your bonds, when you're talking about your overall cash flow for your business, probably going to put a lot of pressure there. And I saw a lot of comments in the chat as you guys were speaking about people thinking that they have to shut down US operations, they have to do things. I honestly encourage everyone to really be careful about that. in the and I put it under this sort of frame, in the same way that you were able to maybe sell so broadly or with one type of strategy into the U.S. because of these types of exemptions or loopholes or whatever you want to think about them. There most likely is still probably ways that you can look at your product, look at your inventory. What should you move into the U.S.? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? I agree with you, though, that just doing everything that you're doing today probably doesn't make sense. But I offer that because that would be the biggest strategy for most businesses, is to probably get a little bit more detailed, a lot more into the weeds, and not simply just rely on the fact that these systems have allowed transactions that you could be shipping from anywhere to anyone, coast to coast, country to country, and it didn't matter. You can obviously still do that. It's just going to be a little bit more expensive. But if you need to protect those margins, I think it's going to come with more intentionality and very sort of surgical and strategic moves for your business more than anything else.
Yeah, Agreed. I really want to comment on two quick things. One thing from the comment section, Jeremy West had been asking about the benefit. Like, if you move the product from Canada to the USA just for warehousing, you don't pay the tariff. And of course, you do pay the tariff, right? To be clear. And you do pay duties. The benefit is that because you're moving the goods prior to there being a sale to the end consumer, you can often benefit from using a different transaction value. You can use the value more than likely, and this is all, it depends, right? Like everything else, but more than likely you use the valuation that you bought from your either manufacturer for. You may have to add some other costs into that, assist other things, but you can likely save a significant amount of money by moving the goods in bulk. But that is an expensive strategy, right? You're paying the duties upfront on inventory that you have not sold yet, and keeping in mind that at the root of valuation, it's by default, it's the value of the imported merchandise, right? Is the price actually paid or payable for the merchandise when sold for exportation to the United States? So if you have already sold it to your end consumer, you more than likely must use the retail value. And there's always exceptions to most things, but that's the typical rule. And so the benefit is really that you can use your lower costs there and pay less duties.
Great. And then just apologies. One last thing on the bonded warehouse, because I had seen something else coming up about it. You also have to remember, while you can put product into a bonded warehouse and obviously defer those payments, those duties and stuff, there are much more stringent restrictions on what can be done to product in a bonded warehouse when it comes to the level of like transformation or something like that. So, it can work for obviously like regular finished goods inventory that's pick and pack and things like that, but taking a bunch of different products and doing reassembly and things like that is typically not permitted inside these types of facilities.
Yes, true. So a couple of things I want to summarize on this particular talking points, which were really, really great, I think. Hugo, just to build on your point about the cost savings, Jeremy, you will also save on the cost of that transactional administration cost per item that you have to clear customs. So every time you move something from Canada into the US, there's going to be fees. Whereas when you do it in bulk with one product or one big bulk concession going into the US, there's savings there. So you'll probably speed the delivery to the client if you're in the US, and you'll also save on that transactional day-to-day piece. Go for it, Hugo.
I'm going to say, keep in mind, this is the merchandise processing fee primarily that we're talking about, also the payment to the customs broker. But when you move to, say, a formal entry, you switch to an ad valorem rate of 0.3464%. So it is a percentage based of your total value. There's also a minimum MPF, which I believe is $32.71 last I checked. And so we have tooling that allows not only sellers, but logistics companies to automate the decision making, right? To say, well, if the value of the goods is low enough, maybe we should use a different entry type. Maybe we should do it this way, right? And so you can start to implement really smart systems, not only as a logistics company, but as the importer, to say we would want to make sure we're doing it the right way, not just from a compliance perspective, but from a cost saving perspective. There's a lot of benefit you can get if you get smart with it.
Absolutely. Before we move on from this, I think the last testament that John made, which is very, very clear, is know your documentation, as Hugo mentioned earlier, but also know which products you really want to focus in on. You don't have to move every single product into the US. You don't have to keep selling every product into the US if your margins aren't good enough, if the movement of that product isn't strong enough. And knowing where your inventory sits is really, really key. So I think it's bringing the two things together. But do not wait. You need to start now. Prepare for all the changes that you need to make to documentation, and start to really work with brokers and shipping solution providers like ourselves, consultants as well as providers, to understand what are the changes that are coming and how you can best set yourself up for success. We're hitting 145 now, so this discussion is phenomenal. But as we get through this, I want to go through some of the slides a little bit quicker, and try and get as much time as we can on the questions. So tariffs don't just affect costs. They fundamentally reshape our business approach to sourcing, production, and pricing. The total exports in January increased by 5.5% on the basis that people knew tariffs were coming. That's a $74.5 billion spend, largely driven by businesses just rushing to get their shipments out before tariff implementation. 3 in 4 consumers in the US are planning to reduce spending if tariff causes prices to rise. And John, I want you to touch on some of the examples in a minute. We're also seeing in Canada a kind of growing buy local movement as consumers react to the tariffs. John, in your thought process, you had a couple of stats that you wanted to share regarding the disposable income that some of these households will now have based on the tariffs. So I'd love you to just jump into that a little bit and talk to us about what you're seeing in the real world.
Yeah, obviously, there's tariffs for business and stuff like that, but it all comes down to your consumers, right? If they feel they still have the buying power, people are likely still to buy. Overall, kind of estimates right now with the way that tariffs are sitting, for the countries impacted, estimating kind of a CPI increase of let's call it 1 to 1.5%, maybe a little bit less, which for most households in the U.S. would be somewhere from about $1,500-$1,600 to $2,000 less overall buying power. The challenge a little bit with that, and Hugo, maybe I'll let you do this because you talked about a great point about the disproportionate areas that you'll see these increases or the spend, but the challenge with some of that is that if you think about the wealth distribution of any population, right? Tariffs are something that are flat, they're fixed, they're the same for everybody. Most countries have graduated income taxes and things like that, depending on how much you make. The tariff is flat, which means that unfortunately people on the lower end of the income earning scale are going to be more disproportionately impacted. Very often too, these are a lot of consumers that their shopping habits are attracted to certain types of value type propositions, or what they spend money on, i.e. essentials, like the percentage of their essentials of their income versus a more wealthy household, for example, is got a very different sort of feel in terms of the pain that's going to be felt. So unfortunately, $2,000 is substantial when you think about retail goods, just your everyday kind of stuff going up and becoming that more expensive. But when you think that maybe more than half of that is going to be felt really, really hard by the sort of that first part of the scale, that's what makes it really difficult as well, just because of that disproportionate amount of earnings and the fact that these cost increases come in for everyone at the same level. So know your customers, I guess, is probably one really important message out of there, because different customers, depending where they're in that scale, are going to be reacting differently to the same stimulus, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think at the high end, right, really high end products, brands are able to take on these tariffs themselves, right? They can absorb the impact, but on smaller items, on really low value items, there's just not room. You can't afford to. So that's where, to your point, lower income will be more substantially lower income people will be more substantially affected by these tariffs. I think from a business perspective, when we talk about strategy, I'm seeing it across the board when I talk to governments, but also to companies, importers. Quality product master data has never been more valuable than right now. If you have great data on your items, right, your country of origin, and you know what it is across the board, if you know your valuation and how you're assessing it, if you can justify how you got to those things, right, through a lens of audit readiness, because what we're seeing there's been a 700%, actually 690% increase in customs inspections and checks over the last 7 years. It's about 100% a year, right? They're doubling every year how closely they're looking at shipments. And the caution here is to make sure that if you were to be stopped, that you can justify the work that you've done, right? Just like in school, show your work, right? If under audit, you could justify how you got there, you're in a good place, you're ahead of most people. And having a good system, not just a system, but a really great, smart system that tells you what you're doing and a partner who you trust to help you navigate, like John or anybody on this call, then you're in a good place for the next, 6 months or 12 months.
Well,
Amazing.
and sorry, I'm just going to add to that on the master data side, because I saw a question earlier about what can a logistics service provider do. So this is very geared towards warehouses. Just because your WMS lets you put in whatever name you want doesn't mean you should. If there's one thing that I can tell you from working with a lot of different warehouses, sort of 3PL partners, is that very often data is entered into that WMS in a way that works for them in their operations and stuff like that, but can get really, really messy when then you're trying to marry that data up with, whether it's customer master data, whether it's other parts of your system, to make sure you're getting the right HTS, like whatever it is. Just like take the time, first time right, set it up properly, give yourself like some kind of like taxonomy and general structure to your naming conventions. Because I've seen some of the wildest stuff I can't even believe goes through these transaction systems.
Well, guys, a big portion of this discussion and from the last slide actually touched upon a lot of things around supply chain shift and country of origin analysis. We'll move on to diversification and just looking at some of the different areas of supply chain. So if China is no longer default as a manufacturing hub, where should businesses be looking in order to avoid these type of tariffs and these type of trade wars? And is that really the right way to look at things? So we have quite a bit of stats there in regards to different countries that people are looking at the moment. But Hugo, beyond cost savings, what are some of the strategic advantages of using different markets for sourcing, different manufacturing hubs, and what are the hidden risks that businesses should be aware of?
This is a very straightforward answer. I'm going to keep it dumb simple, I promise. We don't know the changes that are coming down the pipe, right? Things are changing. And if you decide today at the drop of a hat that, China now has tariffs, so let's move to Vietnam, you'll spend a lot of time and a lot of money making that change. And it could then easily change tomorrow. So you may be find yourself having the same discussion, but not only discussion, investment of time and money. Again, 2 weeks later, which we've seen already, right? Targets Europe 2 weeks after we target China, targets China after we target Canada and Mexico. These changes happen really fast, and it's much more about getting compliant. Compliance is a big word, but getting compliant now, so that you're ready to pivot when we have some more answers, if you need to, right? A lot of people actually are finding that it's much cheaper to just pay the tariff and keep their manufacturing where it is than to move their manufacturing, which is a huge, huge undertaking. Now, maybe you'll find some cost savings by moving. And diversifying is probably a good idea, just generally, right? As we see the world change the strategy on duties and tariffs, not just the United States, but everybody, that really is something worth considering, but it's not the short-term solution. The short-term solution is getting ready for change and being ready to be compliant in a world with much more scrutiny and much more data requirements. And if you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance.
And diversification comes in two areas, right? One is the sourcing part, so where you're manufacturing, but I think we also have a touch point here on diversifying where you're selling your product and where you're expanding out to, right? Any thought process on some of the things to be aware of when trying to explore, let's say, European Union as a new market, or the UK or Australia? So I would say, there's cost of shipping, obviously, but then we also know that, the UK has implemented zero de minimis. So you're paying for duties and everything that you move into that market. So anything else that between yourself, Hugo and John, you want to touch on from a diversification perspective?
I'll jump in quick, and then Hugo, you can go back in. I mean, look, I speak a lot about sort of like logistics service providers and stuff like that. That was a lot of my background. So I do believe in diversification, but I believe in very strategic diversification. So, a lot of major retailers, sort of big brands that you're seeing, will kind of have like what is referred to as like this China plus one. So I definitely encourage everybody to look for alternatives and strategically see where they could build additional capacity or adaptive, like flexibility, for future adaptability. That being said, you've got to remember that there's only so many people that can do certain types of things. Quality is going to matter, cost is going to matter, lead times are going to matter. Like there's a lot of factors when it comes into manufacturing. So anyone exploring diversification, I couldn't agree more with what Hugo said about, like, you don't just jump, because like what happens then when it's the next customer or the next country and the next country. But what you want to do is look at your book of business, look at what your inventory is, look at what you're having produced and whatever, and how do you make sure that you stay important and relevant to those manufacturers, right? Because if you become too small, they're not really going to care whether you're there or not. So how do you stay important, but then strategically, whether it's different cycles of product, different season, different lines, different types, whatever it could be, or same product in two different facilities. But over diversification will kill you just as fast as any other wild kind of competition or tariff. So that's always something to keep in mind for sure. When you're dealing with this kind of situation.
That's huge, John. I love that you just said that. I'm going to throw in there that when we talk about diversification, part of this is considering which countries you sell to, but also what you do with your inventory in those countries as well, right? US stock has never been more valuable than now too. So if you have returns, and considering different parts of your model, right? If you have returns that are being made of e-commerce goods back, and you're shipping them back out of the United States, that was imported before there were duties, right? You could be keeping that in the United States, putting that in a warehouse somewhere, and then refulfilling it, right? And of course, if the goods got destroyed or hurt or damaged or something, that's a different story. But if someone's returning an item in new condition in the United States that was purchased prior to duties and tax, you could be saving 20, 30, 40% on your costs just by keeping that inventory in place. So there are some really strategic ways to optimize here that are not simply how do we avoid paying tariffs, right? You ask that question, you're asking the wrong question. We need to be talking about where's our inventory? What are we buying? Where are we buying it from? How do we store our country of origin? How are we valuing our goods? Are our manufacturers really long-term trade partners for us? Or if we move tomorrow, would they drop us? If we diversified, would they drop us? All sorts of questions.
No, exactly. And, I think more than anything else, and I know it's a wild statement, but, your business has to actually make sense. It has to be profitable, right? Like, I mean,
wild statement.
That just has to be what, yeah, you just have to be able to look at it. I mean, recently there was some information that came out about a beverage brand from the US that's essentially a Cinderella story, like just blew up, massive company, like very, very popular. You find it everywhere. Brought it over to the UK, same kind of product, packaging, approach, merchandising, advertising, tanked, because the reality is those customers are not the same. So that approach that's working in the US, that's connecting that product to a US consumer, means nothing to people in the UK. They actually are turned off by it and are not buying it, let alone that then they feel there's product quality issues compared to what they have. So, make sure that you know why you want to expand. Make sure that you think your product has the right kind of fit, the right kind of market size, like that right kind of demand, right? Understand who you're competing against and like what's your value proposition than others. Because it's going to be harder and harder to compete with either large organizations or just a lot of similar organizations in terms of size, just based on price alone. The price game and that easy kind of ability to crank the value dial there is getting harder to win on, is probably one thing to really keep in mind.
Great. Thank you for that, John. Really appreciate that detail. And I think Hugo loved it too. I love this conversation between the two of you, because I think it's bringing out so many fruits from the discussion, and very practical thought process on how to think as these changes come through. When do nothing is the right move, and what does do nothing mean? Change comes at a cost. Every strategic shift, as Hugo mentioned earlier, you want to move your manufacturing. That's all well and good, but there's a cost to it. Whether it's moving production, diversifying suppliers, or engineering products, requires investment, time, and risk. And in some cases, the most rational decision is to do nothing and ride out the storm. And in some cases, it's the worst decision you could make. So how do businesses assess that decision with confidence? And what should businesses be doing at the moment? So John, for you, doing nothing is not an option. What metrics should businesses track down to know when it's time to shift from a do-nothing approach? And what resources would you recommend for businesses wanting to stay informed with the ongoing tariff developments?
Okay, first, before I answer, Hugo, you got to take it. Like, fix the do nothing. Say, I know that bothers you, so you fix it, and then I'll answer.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I think the point of today, this whole discussion is you need to be intentional with your strategy, and sometimes being intentional does mean doing nothing, but doing nothing is doing something, right? While you're doing nothing of actually moving manufacturing or actually moving your goods, you need to be thinking about what your long-term play is, right? So that means getting your data together, your product data, understanding your vendors and their location, understanding your geopolitical risk, right? If you're manufacturing in countries that could eventually, I'm going to say, be at war with the United States, let's say, for example, whether that's a trade war or a military war, then you need to consider that's huge risk. But doing nothing is definitely not the answer. If you're in logistics and you're sitting by your computer with your hands off the keyboard, I'm not sure what you're doing with your day. That's the wrong choice.
Yeah. So, I agree. At the end of the day, the do nothing is really about like how confident are you in your current strategy and how well does it apply to the market. So it's more, it's more putting it in that frame than anything else. And one thing I offered actually in a post on LinkedIn like last week or something, that was, instead of getting very concerned and feeling out of control because of the fact that these were tariffs, it's the government, they just slapped them on, they were unexpected, no one thought, blah, all of these things, and just kind of falling into that, that mentality. What would you do with your business if a competitor came into your market and essentially started selling the same type of product or selling to your customers at 25% less? Like, what would you do? Because there you would get no support. You wouldn't have anyone else to blame. You'd be frustrated. You may not understand how that person can price that way or if they're just burning cash or whatever it is, but you would have to do something, right? You would choose to react one way or another. Maybe, again, you lean on your brand. You choose that your current strategy is good and strong and whatever, and you don't make any fundamental changes. But to Hugo's point, doing nothing or choosing to not respond is in itself a strategy. So as long as you understand that, I think you're fine. And then if you're not, and you want to do something differently, it becomes, okay, well, how do I get more attention for my brand? How do I maximize on some of these geographies where I'm doing really well? How do I make some of these home run products even more of a home run? And one thing that I often share, and I would offer this both for brands and for service providers, is asking yourself, how can you improve your customer experience? And how can you use your operations, your execution, different parts of your business to drive more value for your brand and take that middle of the pack that you have right now and get them more towards raving fans? Because most brands do really, really well by the strength of their raving fans in the strength of their community.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in and say there's probably never been a better time to talk to someone in trade compliance, right? In global trade, whether that's an external consultant or hiring somebody internally. The reason I say that is those people are really, really useful, not only in, of course, a tariffs discussion, right, and figuring out duties, but also in manufacturing, in law, in legal, in all parts of your business, even in sales and marketing and deciding which markets you grow into. The other side of this is the most important lens that I think all of us logistics people forget, which John has been pointing out, I've been saying, is that the most important thing is you're delivering value for your client, right? Yes, logistics, it's confusing and there's all sorts of things going on. But at the end of the day, we all want to grow sales, right? Make opportunity, make the experience seamless for our end customer. And customs is an uncontrolled variable today, right? It's really, especially lately, it's a really uncontrolled variable. So whatever you can do to make it controllable and within your control is what you should be doing now, even if that looks like doing nothing to the outside, even if to your end customer, they're paying the same money or they're paying extra, right? Based on what you have in place. You should be considering your long-term strategy. You should be considering the experience of the end consumer. And if you're lazy, you'll lose business. You will lose against the big players who have the money, resources, time, and knowledge to execute faster than you.
That's perfect. Thank you, guys. I think just the last question before we go into question and answer is what are the key financial and strategic metrics businesses should be analyzing? And John, Hugo, you guys have been going through these throughout the slides, but I think if we can capture a few that are really, really key for some of our audience and people who are going to be listening to this at the end, what are some of the key financial and strategic metrics businesses should be analyzing right now, and should be working on?
Sure. Yeah, go on, John.
For me, I'll kind of just give one main one that I think probably not enough people spend enough time with. But since you're talking about manufacturing, you're talking about bringing product into the country or whatever it is, it's really looking at your inventory. And that means like looking at your sales patterns, for example, looking how long you're holding certain inventories, your minimum order quantities from your current manufacturer, for example. Like, what does that mean in terms of how long it sits in a warehouse? Are you paying storage fees? Are you paying, what do you do with returns? Like, is it sitting there too long? Like, I really think that, finding out how you can kind of tighten up and make sure that you have the stuff that will have the best ability for you to sell without carrying this long tail is something that is really important. And also understanding that, if you've split your inventory, if you've got stuff in different places, like, what might work on the East Coast may not work as well on the West Coast, or different SKUs, different variants. And don't get too overly complex, right? Like, it's very common in apparel. I was doing some work not too long ago where, for every SKU, there was an average of 9 variants because of sizes and colors. Like, that's wild. Like, how you don't have to have that many different types of shirts or t-shirts or pants or whatever before you're literally carrying hundreds and hundreds. And for them, it was thousands and tens of thousands of SKUs. But like that really has an impact. So, try to be very, again, intentional and very focused about what you're doing. So cost to carry inventory, your minimum order quantities, your velocity of your sales, all of these things I think really matter. And then like even Hugo mentioned, returns I think is a growing thing, just to understand like how much of your product is coming back, of that return product, how much of it goes back to resellable, and then how long does it sit before it's resold. All of these things that are just sitting in your system and like chipping away at your overall profitability that probably isn't getting a ton of attention today.
That was awesome. I so agree. 100% agree. I'm going to say a lot of this is just asking the question, actually, saying, what are we doing with returns? It kind of doesn't matter what you are, but knowing what you're doing is at least the first step. Things like your inventory placement, I agree. I think a lot of what you said is usually my take, is the proactive approach, right? Is how do we get ahead of the issue? And I'm going to say, because you've covered it, I'm going to take the other side of it, which is what do we do? How do we make sure that we've not fallen behind? So I'd be tracking some lagging indicators too, like your on-time delivery percentage. It's a great thing to be tracking right now, and doing that on a market-by-market basis, right? How often are we late on shipments? Monitoring your end-to-end tracking and making sure your customers are receiving your goods, their goods. And then also making sure that duties aren't out of whack. I mean, sometimes things go wrong. Carriers make mistakes. I'd be holding them accountable if you can have the systems in place and make sure that they're charging you and or your customers the right amount of duty. You don't want to be making mistakes there and artificially inflating the prices of your goods. I'd be holding your vendors accountable right now to MOQs, all sorts of anything in your agreement that's in there. You should be holding them accountable right now, and ideally trying to negotiate in your interest. I think that covers sort of how do we find that we've missed something, is that your on-time delivery percentage will go down because things are getting stuck at customs more, or because there's delays somewhere in your logistics network. And those are lagging indicators of all the other work we've just talked about doing for the last hour.
Yep. Thank you for that, guys. Couple of questions I want to bring up from a little bit earlier. So Brenda mentioned that she is concerned about brokerage fees being added onto the order to calculate duties, taxes, and tariffs. I think this is a question that probably everybody has. It's a very simplified question, but where can we find the right resources to calculate these type of costs in advance? And Hugo, you touched on potentially using softwares at checkout, but is there other tools that they can use proactively before the product even gets to checkout?
Yeah, I'm going to throw out there a bit of a shameless plug, because it's exactly what we do all day, every day, is that our company pretty much helps you manage this data. So I'd start there and say you need a system that's telling you where to focus your efforts, especially if you have a catalog that's larger than 100 items or so. It's hard to manage. How are you staying on top of all the rules for all your products? From there, it's making sure that you know the cost of your, say, agreements with your brokers or with your shipping partners. to make sure that clearance into each country is seamless, but also is cost effective. And you can then make some decisions on their behalf. You can make those decisions as a brand. You can say, we want to clear all of our goods with a formal entry, and do it in advance. You can decide on your inventory placement, but you have to own the process. At the end of the day, it's the importer of record or the brand who pay, who's responsible for compliance, and then who pays is a different story sometimes. And Benita, thank you for the comment. That's right. Easy to know what's going on all the time for all your products.
I think the next question.
Sorry,
yes,
apologies.
Just
on that one too. I think it's important to understand that depending on who you work with too, there may be different processes just because they have to submit it the same way. Like for example, to the U.S. government or the border, how different type of brokers operate, what they might ask from you, what they may charge, how they want to do it. Like that's something else that now becomes maybe part of your fulfillment evaluation, your partner evaluation, because not everyone does everything exactly the same way or has the exact same expectations from you as a brand when it comes to data, accuracy, fields, blah, blah, whatever it could be. So just keep that in mind when you're talking about those fees as well. They're relative to what you do, what they do, and vice versa.
Hugo, you threw in a plug there, which I'm more than happy to touch on. So the company name is Tru Identity, correct?
Yeah, you can find us at truregister.com. That's TRU register.com. But also, I think following on LinkedIn, I post a bunch of stuff that will keep you up to date. I know we all kind of repost things, but I try and really break things down nice and simple because there's a lot of not only hard to understand information, but bad information online. So I'd find people you trust, whether that's anybody on this call, let alone me or my company. But I think that there's tools and solutions that are not expensive that can get you going, but you still need someone trusted who knows what they're doing to set you up right, to get you ready for the future. And I think you need to explore that option too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to give John the opportunity. I mean, if businesses are in this place right now and they're confused about their next step, how does operational innovations help them? And what can you do to support some of these listeners today and listeners that are going to be watching this in a few days from now? What is it that you do and how can you support these guys?
Yeah, probably some of the easiest things right off the bat would be really helping you understand, your inventory, your sales, what you're transacting to who, what way, validating any of your sort of costs or charges all around that so that you can get that baseline from your profitability. Finding then different ways to potentially see if you can streamline or contain some of the costs on how you're executing some of these things. But probably the most interesting thing here for people would be, how do you navigate so you can keep your sales engine going, and like what is the right stuff to put in the right place, and maybe what different types of strategies should you use? Because like I've said to you guys before, I think the world has become very appified, and people think that just because they pass stuff through systems like Shopify or different types of things that it's all good. But keep in mind that just because it's happening doesn't mean it's necessarily at the best level or the best way for your business. So really just using that execution of what you're doing to make sure that your operations support your sales, because that's kind of really what we're here for, because without any sales, there's nothing to move anyway.
Perfect, guys. I want to really, really thank you. I think just before I leave you, for the audience, what eShipper is able to bring to the table is the movement of products. So we're in the logistics side. Once you've got the advice from Hugo and you've understood your product set, your strategy, you need to move that product into the US compliantly, or you need to move that product across the world. That's where we're able to support you.